The slot machines were still ringing when I collapsed in the parking lot of Thunder Creek Casino. Blood streaming from my nose, vision blurring, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. My insulin pen had been empty for 3 days. 3 days of rationing, of praying, of watching my blood sugar climb into the danger zone while my parents fed our grocery money into machines that would never love them back. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I was 17 years old, and I was dying in a casino parking lot because my mother chose the poker table over my prescription. My name is Alicia Harrington, and from wherever you're watching this, I need you to understand something. There's a difference between being unlucky and being abandoned. Unlucky is when life deals you a bad hand. Abandoned is when the people who are supposed to protect you fold every time you need them most. The night I nearly died, my mother was inside celebrating a $200 jackpot. $200. That's exactly what my monthly insulin cost. She'd hit that jackpot while I was outside in our rusted Honda Civic, shaking and sweating, watching the casino's neon lights blur together like watercolors in the rain. I'd called her phone 6 times. 6 desperate calls that went straight to voicemail because she always turned her phone to silent when she gambled. Couldn't have distractions when she was chasing the next big win. Couldn't have her diabetic daughter interrupting the most important relationship in her life. When the paramedics found me, I was unconscious. Diabetic ketoacidosis, they called it. My body had started eating itself because it couldn't process sugar without insulin. The EMT told me later that I was maybe an hour away from a coma, maybe 2 hours from something worse. But here's what still haunts me. When my mother finally came running out of the casino, mascara streaked down her cheeks. Clutching that crumpled jackpot ticket, she looked at me being loaded into the ambulance and said, "Alicia, why didn't you just come inside and get me?" As if walking into that casino wouldn't have triggered every anxiety attack I'd ever had. As if I hadn't been taught since childhood that the casino was her sacred space, her church, her therapy session, and I was just the burden waiting in the car. You want to know what rock bottom looks like? It's not the moment you realize your parents have a problem. It's the moment you realize you were never important enough to be their solution. I spent 4 days in the intensive care unit. 4 days of nurses checking my vitals every hour, of doctors asking carefully worded questions about my home life, of social workers with kind eyes and clipboards full of concerns. My father showed up on day 2, reeking of cigarettes and slot machine air freshener, holding a gas station bouquet and apologies that felt as cheap as the flowers. "Baby girl, we're gonna get this figured out," he said, squeezing my hand with fingers that trembled from withdrawal. He hadn't been to the casino in 48 hours, and his body was already rebelling. "Soon as you're better, we're gonna make some changes." But I could see it in his eyes. The same look my mother got when she promised this was the last time, when she swore she'd never choose gambling over groceries again. It was the look of someone who meant every word they said and knew they were lying anyway. Dr. Martinez, my endocrinologist, pulled my parents aside that 3rd day. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation, but hospital walls are thin and desperate teenagers have excellent hearing. She explained that my diabetes wasn't a phase, wasn't something I'd outgrow, wasn't an inconvenience they could postpone when the slots were calling. "This is a life-threatening condition that requires consistent medication and monitoring," she said in that calm, professional voice doctors use when they're trying not to scream. "Missing insulin doses can cause permanent organ damage, blindness, or death. There's no gambling with this." The irony of her word choice wasn't lost on me. My parents have been gambling with my life for 2 years, and the house always wins. My mother's response was what broke something inside me permanently. "Doctor, we understand. We're good parents. This was just bad timing. We had everything under control until this happened. Bad timing." as if my pancreas had chosen the worst possible moment to need life-sustaining medication, as if my body had inconsiderately required insulin right when the poker tournament was heating up. That's when I knew, sitting in that hospital bed, IV drip in my arm, surrounded by machines that were doing a better job of keeping me alive than my own family, I knew I was on my own. See, this wasn't the first time. This was just the first time I almost died. 3 months earlier, I'd rationed my insulin for a week because my parents had blown their paychecks on a weekend trip to Thunder Creek Casino. They'd driven 2 hours to a bigger casino with higher stakes and better odds, chasing a jackpot that would solve all their problems. They came home Sunday night, broke and defeated, and found me in bed with blood sugar readings that should have sent me straight to the emergency room. "Why didn't you call us?" my mother had asked, standing in my doorway with her casino rewards card still hanging around her neck like a badge of honor. I'd looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she genuinely didn't understand. She couldn't comprehend that I'd been raised to never, ever interrupt their gambling. That I'd been trained since childhood to handle every crisis alone rather than disturb their sacred casino time. 6 months before that, I'd collapsed at school during a math test. My blood sugar had crashed because I'd been stretching my insulin for 3 days, trying to make it last until they remembered to pick up my prescription. The school nurse had called my parents, but they were at the casino. She'd called my emergency contact, my grandmother. But she lived 4 states away, so I'd sit in the nurse's office, eating glucose tablets and drinking orange juice, watching other kids get picked up by parents who cared more about their children than their next bet. When my mother finally arrived 3 hours later, she was irritated, not worried, not scared, not apologetic. Irritated that she'd had to leave the blackjack table when she was on a winning streak. "Alicia, you know how to handle this," she'd said, barely looking at me as she signed the dismissal papers. "You're old enough to manage your condition." I was 15 years old. Old enough to inject myself with insulin. Old enough to check my blood sugar. Old enough to count carbs and calculate doses. But not old enough to understand why my medical needs were always an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to love me. The pattern was always the same. Crisis, promise, relapse, repeat. They'd swear they'd never gamble again, would flush their casino rewards cards down the toilet, would promise to put my health first. And I'd believe them, because what choice did I have? When you're 17 and diabetic and your parents are your only lifeline to the medication that keeps you alive, you believe every promise, no matter how many times they've broken it. But, lying in that hospital bed, listening to my mother make excuses to a doctor who could see right through her, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't going to die young because of diabetes. I was going to die young because of them. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, came to see me on my last day in the hospital. She was maybe 40, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too, many kids like me. She sat down next to my bed and opened her folder, but she didn't look at the papers inside. "Alicia," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you feel safe at home?" It was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Safe from what? Physical abuse? Yes. Emotional neglect? Absolutely not. Medical neglect? Well, I was sitting in a hospital bed because my parents had chosen, gambling over my insulin, so you tell me. "They're not bad people," I said, because that's what kids like me always say. "They just have a problem." She nodded like she'd heard this before. Having a problem doesn't mean they get to make it your problem too. But that's exactly what they'd done. For 2 years, they'd made their gambling addiction my problem. When they lost money, I lost insulin. When they chased jackpots, I chased them through casino parking lots, begging them to remember that I existed. When they hit rock bottom, they dragged me down with them. The day I was discharged, my parents picked me up in a car that reeked of casino smoke. My mother had a new Players Club card in her wallet, fresh from signing up at a different casino. My father was already talking about a sure-thing bet that would help us catch up on bills. Nothing had changed. I'd nearly died, and nothing had changed. That's when I stopped being their daughter and started being their adversary. Not out of hatred, but out of survival. Because when your parents choose slot machines over your life, you don't have the luxury of being a child anymore. You become whatever you need to become to stay alive, and I needed to become someone who could beat them at their own game. The ride home from the hospital was silent, except for the GPS directions to Thunder Creek Casino. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. We had a 20-minute drive home, but they'd programmed the GPS to the casino because that's where we were going first. Just for a few minutes, my mother said, not looking at me in the rearview mirror. I've got a system that's been working, and I need to check something. I sat in the back seat, discharge papers crumpled in my lap, and watched the casino's neon sign grow larger through the windshield. The same sign I'd stared at while I was dying in their parking lot 4 days earlier. The same building where my mother had been celebrating a jackpot while I was slipping into diabetic coma. And that's when I knew. This wasn't going to end with them getting help. This wasn't going to end with family therapy or gambling addiction counseling or promises to change. This was going to end with me taking control, because control was the only thing standing between me and a very early grave. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The account my grandmother had set up for me when I turned 16, the one my parents didn't know existed, the one where I'd been saving every birthday dollar and babysitting. Payment for 2 years, $3,412. Not enough to move out, not enough to pay for college, but enough to start planning, enough to start building something they couldn't gamble away. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. As we pulled into the casino parking lot, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for them to choose me. I wasn't going to hope they'd love me more than they loved the next jackpot. I was going to make sure they never had the chance to gamble with my life again. It didn't start with casinos. It started with scratch-off tickets at the Quick Mart on Elm Street, back when I was 12 and still believed my parents hung the moon. My father, Marcus Harrington, worked construction. 40-hour weeks when the weather was good, unemployment, checks when it wasn't. My mother, Diana, cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, scrubbing toilets and dusting picture frames of other people's happy memories. They were hard-working people who deserved better than the hand life had dealt them. That's what I told myself for years. That's the story I built in my head to explain why they started buying lottery tickets with the grocery money. "It's just $2, my mother would say, feeding a crumpled bill into the lottery machine while I stood beside her, counting the items we'd have to put back because we were short on cash. $2 could change everything, Allie. Allie. That's what they called me before I became a burden. Before my pancreas decided to stage a rebellion and require expensive medication for the rest of my life. Before I became the thing standing between them and their dreams of easy money. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 3 weeks before my 14th birthday. The symptoms had been building for months. Constant thirst, frequent urination, weight loss, fatigue that made me feel like I was moving through water. My parents kept saying it was just a growth spurt, just teenage stuff, just me being dramatic. The day I collapsed at soccer practice, Coach Martinez drove me straight to the emergency room. My blood sugar was over 400, my body was in ketosis, and I was maybe hours away from a diabetic coma. The doctor explained that my pancreas had stopped producing insulin, probably forever, and I'd need daily injections for the rest of my life. My parents took the news differently than I expected. My father cried, sitting in that plastic hospital chair with his work boots still caked in concrete dust. My mother held my hand and promised we'd figure it out together, that money wasn't more important than my health, that everything would be okay. For about 6 months, they kept that promise. They learned about carb counting and blood sugar testing. My father watched YouTube videos about diabetes management until 2 in the morning, taking notes on the back of his pay stubs. My mother rearranged our entire kitchen, organizing it by carb content and glycemic index like she was preparing for a medical exam. They even threw me a diabetes-versary party on the 1-month anniversary of my diagnosis, with sugar-free cake and candles shaped like insulin pens. It was corny and sweet, and exactly what a scared 14-year-old needed to believe that maybe having diabetes wouldn't ruin everything. But medical bills have a way of crushing even the best intentions. Insulin alone was $800 a month without insurance. Test strips, lancets, glucose tablets, continuous glucose monitors. The supplies added up to more than my father made in a week. Our insurance covered some of it, but the copays and deductibles might as well have been asking us to pay for a mortgage on the moon. That's when the lottery tickets turned into something else, something desperate. If we could just hit the big one, my mother started saying, standing in longer lines at different stores, buying tickets with increasingly complex number combinations. Just one, Sally. Just enough to get ahead of these medical bills. My father started bringing home casino flyers from work. Bright, glossy advertisements promising free meals and sign-up bonuses for new players. He'd spread them across our kitchen table like he was studying for finals, highlighting the promotions and calculating odds with the same intensity he'd once applied to my diabetes management. "Look at this," he'd say, pointing to a picture of a smiling couple holding an oversized check. These people were just like us, regular folks who took a chance and changed their lives. I should have seen the warning signs. The way my mother's eyes lit up when she talked about jackpots. The way my father started working overtime not to pay down our debt, but to fund longer casino trips. The way conversations about my insulin needs started getting shorter, while discussions about betting strategies got longer. The first time they chose gambling over my medication, I didn't even realize what was happening. It was a Tuesday in October, 3 months after my 15th birthday. My insulin pen was running low, and I'd mentioned it to my mother that morning before school. She nodded absently, already dressed in her lucky casino outfit, a purple sweater she'd worn the night she won $100 on penny slots. When I got home that afternoon, I found a note on the refrigerator. Gone to Thunder Creek with Dad. Back tonight. Leftover pizza in the fridge. Love you. My insulin ran out that evening. I called their phones, but they'd learned to turn them off at the casino because ringing phones were considered bad luck by other gamblers. I rationed the few units I had left, checking my blood sugar every hour, watching the numbers climb into dangerous territory. They came home at 3 in the morning, reeking of cigarette smoke and disappointment. Empty-handed, empty-pocketed, and empty of excuses when they saw me sitting at the kitchen table with my blood glucose meter reading 287. "Oh, honey," my mother said, and I could see the exact moment she remembered. "Your insulin. We were going to stop at the pharmacy on the way home, but it was closed." It was a lie, and we all knew it. Pharmacies have 24-hour locations. They could have picked up my prescription before they left for the casino, or called ahead to have it ready, or set an alarm on their phones to remind them. But acknowledging that would have meant acknowledging that they'd forgotten me entirely, that for 8 hours I'd simply ceased to exist in their minds because slot machines were ringing and cards were being dealt and jackpots were waiting to be won. "We'll get it first thing in the morning," my father promised, avoiding my eyes. "You'll be fine until then." But I wasn't fine. I spent that night in my room, testing my blood sugar every 2 hours, calculating how long I could survive without insulin, wondering if I should call 911 or just pray that my pancreas would magically start working again. That was the night I started keeping a diabetes emergency kit hidden in my bedroom. Glucose tablets, extra test strips, my father's emergency credit card number written on a piece of paper and taped inside my geometry textbook. Because I'd learned something that night that no 15-year-old should have to learn. The people who are supposed to protect you sometimes forget you exist. The pattern established itself quickly after that. Casino trip planned. Insulin needs forgotten. Big jackpot chased, prescription pickup delayed, lucky streak started, blood sugar crisis ignored. They developed an entire vocabulary of minimization. It was never, "We chose gambling over your medication." It was bad timing, or miscommunication, or "We thought you had enough left." They became experts at gaslighting a diabetic teenager, convincing me that my medical needs were somehow unpredictable, unreasonable, or poorly timed. "You need to be more responsible about tracking your supplies," my mother would say after coming home from a casino binge to find me rationing insulin. "We can't read your mind, Allie," as if I hadn't been telling them for days that I was running. Low, as if I hadn't left notes on their bathroom mirror, sent texts to their phones, and circled dates on the kitchen calendar in red ink. By the time I turned 16, I was essentially managing my diabetes alone. I learned to forge my mother's signature on prescription pickups. I memorized our insurance information and called the pharmacy myself to check on refills. I started working weekend shifts at a local diner, not for spending money, but for insulin money. That job saved my life more times than I can count. Every paycheck went straight into a secret savings account my grandmother had helped me open during one of her rare visits. She'd taken one look at our house, casino flyers scattered across, every surface, lottery tickets stuffed into kitchen drawers. My parents' eyes glazed with that particular desperation that comes from chasing losses with bigger bets, and quietly slipped me her bank's business card. "Some things," she'd whispered while my parents were arguing about which casino had the loosest slots, "are too important to gamble with." My grandmother understood something my parents never would, that gambling addiction doesn't just destroy the gambler. It destroys everyone in their orbit, especially the ones who can't survive without consistent care and attention. The diner job was my lifeline, but it was also my education in human behavior. I watched families share meals, celebrate birthdays, and comfort each other through difficult times. I served couples who talked about their children's achievements with genuine pride, parents who rushed home early because their kid had a soccer game or a school play. I learned what normal looked like, and it looked nothing like my life. Normal. Parents didn't spend their children's medical fund on poker games. Normal families didn't plan vacations around casino promotional weekends. Normal teenagers didn't hide insulin pens in their school lockers because they were afraid their parents would sell them for gambling money. Yes, sell them. By the time I was 16, I'd learned to hide everything valuable in our house. My diabetes, supplies, my work tips, my school textbooks. Anything that could be pawned or returned for cash was fair game when they were chasing losses. I came home from work one evening to find my continuous glucose monitor missing from my bedside table. It was a $300 device that tracked my blood sugar levels throughout the day, alerting me to dangerous highs and lows. My insurance only covered one per year. I found my mother in the garage, standing next to my father's workbench, with my glucose monitor in her hands and tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered when she saw me. "I'm so sorry, Allie. I thought maybe we could return it, just for a few days, just until we get even again." She'd been planning to return my life-saving medical device to fund another casino trip. She'd been willing to gamble with my ability to detect potentially fatal blood sugar drops because she was convinced the next jackpot would solve all our problems. That's when I realized my parents weren't just gambling addicts. They were gambling addicts who saw their diabetic daughter as an obstacle to their addiction, not a reason to overcome it. The worst part wasn't the money they lost or the bills they couldn't pay. The worst part was watching them become strangers. The parents who'd once researched diabetes management with the dedication of medical students were replaced by hollow-eyed gamblers who couldn't remember when I'd last checked my blood sugar. My father, who'd once set alarms on his phone to remind me to test before meals, started getting irritated when my glucose meter beeped during his poker shows. My mother, who'd once called my endocrinologist with detailed questions about my treatment plan, stopped making appointments altogether because they conflicted with casino tournaments. They weren't evil people. They were sick people who'd convinced themselves that their sickness was more important than my health. They'd built an entire mythology around gambling, that they were just unlucky, that they were due for a big win, that their system would eventually pay off. And I was the inconvenient reality that kept interfering with their fantasy. By my 17th birthday, I was essentially an orphan living with two gambling addicts who happened to share my DNA. They fed me when they remembered, included me in conversations when I wasn't interrupting their casino planning, and acknowledged my medical needs when I was literally dying in front of them. But here's what they didn't know. While they were studying poker odds and slot machine patterns, I was studying them. I was learning their tells, their weaknesses, their triggers. I was memorizing every casino they frequented, every game they preferred, every promotion they couldn't resist. I was building a profile of their addiction with the same methodical precision they'd once applied to my diabetes care. Because I'd realized something during those long nights alone in my room, rationing insulin and wondering if I'd wake up in the morning. If you can't beat addiction, you have to beat the addict. And I was about to become very, very good at beating them at their own game. The moment everything changed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a screaming fight or a tearful confrontation. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was standing in the bathroom at Thunder Creek Casino staring at my reflection, in a mirror that had probably witnessed 1,000 broken dreams. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be at my after-school job at the diner, serving coffee to people who tipped in actual money instead of empty promises. But I'd gotten a call from the hospital billing department that morning, and everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation had crumbled in a single phone conversation. "Miss Harrington," the woman had said in that carefully neutral voice billing department's perfect for delivering bad news, "we need to discuss your outstanding balance for your recent emergency room visit." I'd pulled over in the school parking lot, engine still running, senior year chemistry homework scattered across my passenger seat. "How much?" I'd asked, even though I was afraid to know. $37,412. The number hit me like a physical blow. $37,000 for 4 days in the hospital. For the insulin that saved my life, the monitoring that kept me stable, the doctors who'd explained to my parents why their daughter had nearly died in a casino parking lot. "But we have insurance," I'd stammered, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Your insurance was suspended 6 months ago for non-payment of premiums," she explained gently. "Your parents were notified multiple times, but the account shows no response to our communications." 6 months. They'd been letting our health insurance lapse for 6 months while I was rationing insulin, and they were feeding our premium payments into slot machines. Every medical bill, every prescription, every test strip had been going onto a tab that would follow me into adulthood like a shadow. But that wasn't the turning point. That was just information, devastating as it was. The turning point came when I drove to Thunder Creek Casino to confront them with this news, and found them at their usual table in the poker room, surrounded by stacks of chips that represented more money than we'd had in our checking account in years. They were winning. For the first time in months, maybe years, my parents were actually ahead. My mother was laughing, actually laughing, as she arranged her chips into neat little towers. My father was telling stories to the other players, animated and confident, in a way I hadn't seen since before my diagnosis. They looked happy, they looked alive. They looked like the parents I remembered from before diabetes and bills and the slow descent into addiction had consumed our family. And I realized, standing there watching them celebrate while my medical debt climbed toward $40,000, that this was who they really were. Not the struggling, desperate people I'd been making excuses for. Not the loving parents who'd gotten in over their heads with a gambling problem. They were people who were happier at a poker table than they'd ever been at my bedside. The pit boss, a woman in her 50s with platinum blonde hair and shrewd eyes, noticed me first. "Honey," she said, approaching me near the entrance to the poker room, "you can't be in here if you're under 21. I'm looking for my parents, I said, pointing toward their table. Marcus and Diana Harrington. Her expression shifted slightly, the professional smile wavering. Oh, you're Alicia. The way she said my name, like she'd heard it before, made something cold settle in my stomach. You know who I am? Honey? She said more gently, glancing toward my parents' table and then back to me. Why don't we step outside for a minute? Her name was Sandra Chen, and she'd been working at Thunder Creek Casino for 12 years. She'd watched my parents' gambling escalate from weekend entertainment to full-time obsession. She'd seen them lose their car payment, their house payment, and what she delicately referred to as other important expenses. They talk about you, she said as we stood in the hallway between the poker room and the main casino floor. Your father shows pictures of you to the other players. Tell everyone about how smart you are, how proud he is that you're graduating early, how you're going to college on a scholarship. The irony was suffocating. He was bragging about my achievements, with the same mouth that had told me we couldn't afford my insulin. But Sandra, I said, testing her name, finding it easier to talk to this stranger than it had been to talk to my parents in months. They're winning tonight. I saw the chips. Her smile was sad in a way that told me she'd had this conversation before. Honey, they're up about $800 tonight. You know how much they've lost here in the last 6 months? I shook my head, not sure I wanted to know. According to our player tracking system, they're down $43,000. $43,000. Almost exactly the amount of my medical debt. That's when it hit me. Not like a revelation, but like a slow dawning horror. My parents hadn't been struggling to pay for my medical care while fighting a gambling addiction. They'd been funding their gambling addiction by avoiding my medical care, every insulin prescription they'd delayed, every doctor's appointment they'd canceled, every insurance premium they'd skipped. It had all gone to fund their casino habits. My diabetes wasn't a financial burden they couldn't handle. It was a convenient excuse to redirect money toward their addiction. I wasn't their sick daughter they were struggling to support. I was their unwitting business partner in a venture that was designed to fail. Sandra, I said quietly, can you tell me exactly how their player rewards program works? She studied my face for a moment, and I could see her making a decision. Why don't you come with me to my office? Sandra's office was small and cramped, filled with filing cabinets and computer monitors that tracked every bet, every win, every loss that happened on the casino floor. She pulled up my parents' account on her screen, and I saw their entire gambling history laid out in neat digital rows. They had a credit line with the casino, $25,000 that they could borrow against future gambling, with interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. They'd maxed it out twice and paid it down with money I now realized had come from skipped medical expenses. The thing about gambling addiction, Sandra said, scrolling through months of data, is that it's not really about the money. It's about the feeling, the rush, the possibility. Your parents aren't here because they think they're going to get rich. They're here because this is the only place they feel alive. I stared at the screen, watching numbers scroll past that represented every crisis my family had faced. The month my continuous glucose monitor was lost coincided with a $5,000 losing streak. The week I'd rationed insulin for 4 days matched up with a casino tournament entry fee. But they're not bad people, I said, and I realized I was still defending them even as the evidence of their betrayal scrolled across a computer screen. No, Sandra agreed. They're not bad people. They're sick people who've learned to sacrifice everything else for their addiction, including you. That's when she showed me something that changed everything. Your parents have been asking about our employment opportunities, she said, pulling up another screen. They want to work here. Your father applied for a security position, and your mother put in an application for cocktail service. They wanted to work at the casino. While I was working double shifts at a diner to afford insulin, they were trying to get jobs at the place that was destroying our family. They wanted to be surrounded by their addiction 24 hours a day. Sandra, I said, and my voice sounded strange and distant. "How does someone become a casino owner?" She laughed, thinking I was joking. But when she saw my expression, her smile faded. "It's not like opening a restaurant, honey. You need licensing, capital, regulatory approval. You need millions of dollars and years of experience in gaming operations. But it can be done? Well, yes, but... And casinos make money because the odds always favor the house? That's the business model, yes." I stood up, suddenly feeling clearer than I had in years. "Sandra, I need to ask you a favor." "What kind of favor?" "I need you to teach me how this business works. Everything. The odds, the regulations, the licensing requirements, the financial structures. I need to understand how casinos operate from the inside." She stared at me for a long moment. "Alicia, what are you planning?" That's when I told her about the medical debt, about the lapsed insurance, about years of rationing medication while my parents fed our future into machines designed to take everything. I told her about the night I'd nearly died in their parking lot while my mother celebrated a jackpot inside. When I finished, Sandra was quiet for several minutes. "You want to buy this place?" she said finally. "I want to own the thing that owns them. That's not how addiction recovery works, honey." "I'm not trying to cure their addiction," I said. "I'm trying to survive it." Sandra Chen became my first teacher in what would become my life's work. Not just understanding casinos, but understanding the psychology of gambling, the mathematics of probability, the intricate web of regulations and licenses that govern the gaming industry. She started by explaining the basic economics. Thunder Creek Casino grossed about $12 million a year. After expenses, licensing fees, employee salaries, and debt service, they netted roughly $2 million in profit. The current owner, a man named Robert Kellerman, had bought the casino 15 years earlier for $8 million and had been looking to sell for the past 2 years. "The asking price is $22 million, Sandra said. "Plus, you'd need operating capital, which means you're looking at about $25 million to make this work." $25 million. I had $3,400 in my secret savings account. But I also had something most casino buyers didn't have: intimate knowledge of the customer base. I'd been studying my parents' gambling patterns for years. I knew when they were most likely to bet, what games they preferred, what promotions they couldn't resist. I understood the psychology of addiction not from textbooks, but from watching it consume the people who were supposed to love me. "Sandra," I said, "what if I told you I had a business plan that could increase this casino's profits by 30% in the first year?" "I'd say you're 17 years old with no business experience, and you're thinking emotionally instead of logically. What if I could prove it?" That's when I showed her my notebooks. 3 years of detailed observations about my parents' gambling habits, their peak playing times, their response to different promotional strategies, their tolerance for loss, and their triggers for extended play. But more than that, I'd been studying the other players too. During my countless hours in casino parking lots and lobbies, I'd watched hundreds of gamblers. I'd identified patterns in their behavior, demographic trends, seasonal variations in play styles. I'd essentially conducted an unofficial market research study without realizing it. Sandra read through my notes with growing amazement. "Alicia, this is actually sophisticated analysis. Where did you learn to do this?" "I learned to survive," I said. And surviving my parents' addiction meant understanding it better than they did. That night, I went home to find my parents counting their winnings from the evening. $800 in cash spread across our kitchen table like they'd just robbed a bank. "Look, Allie," my mother said, her eyes bright with the kind of joy I hadn't seen since my diagnosis. "We had the most amazing night. Your father hit a straight flush, and I had a hot streak on the wheel that lasted 2 hours." They were celebrating $800 while owing $43,000 to the casino and $37,000 to the hospital. They were happy about winning money they'd lose back within a week while their daughter's medical debt mounted into 6 figures. But I didn't get angry. For the first time in years, I didn't feel rage or disappointment or desperate hope that they'd change. I felt nothing. And that nothingness was the most liberating sensation I'd ever experienced. "That's great," I said, and I meant it. "I'm happy you had a good night." Because their good night had just shown me exactly how I was going to destroy them. Not with anger or confrontation or family therapy. I was going to destroy them with mathematics, with business strategy, with the same cold calculation they'd been using to sacrifice my health for their addiction. I was going to become the house. And the house always wins. The first thing I learned about acquiring a casino is that it's not about having $25 million. It's about convincing other people to give you $25 million. And the second thing I learned is that a 17-year-old girl with perfect grades, detailed market research, and an absolutely ruthless business plan can be surprisingly convincing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I could even think about buying Thunder Creek Casino, I needed to understand every aspect of how it operated. Sandra Chen became my unofficial mentor, but she wasn't my only teacher. I started spending my free periods in the school library, researching gaming regulations, casino management strategies, and hospitality industry trends. I learned about revenue streams beyond gambling: restaurants, hotels, entertainment venues, conference facilities. I studied successful casino acquisitions, bankruptcy proceedings, and regulatory compliance requirements. While my classmates were worried about prom themes and college dorm assignments, I was reading quarterly reports from publicly traded casino companies and memorizing the Nevada Gaming Control Board's licensing requirements. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the shift in my academic focus during a routine senior year check-in. "Alicia," she said, reviewing my recent library activity, "you've checked out 17 books about business management and hospitality operations in the last month. Are you considering changing your college major from pre-med to business?" I'd been planning to study medicine, partly because I understood diabetes so intimately, partly because I wanted to help other kids navigate chronic illness. But sitting in her office, surrounded by college brochures and scholarship applications, I realized my path had changed completely. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, "what do you know about entrepreneurship programs?" 3 weeks later, I had a meeting with Dr. Patricia Vance, the director of the University of Nevada's Hospitality and Gaming Management program. She was a former casino executive who'd transitioned to academia, and Sandra had connected us through a professional network I was just beginning to understand. Dr. Vance reviewed my self-compiled research portfolio in her office overlooking the Las Vegas Strip. 40 pages of market analysis, demographic studies, revenue optimization strategies, and detailed observations about gambling behavior patterns. "Miss Harrington," she said after spending 20 minutes reading my work in silence, "this is graduate-level analysis. Where did you learn to conduct this kind of market research?" "I learned to survive," I said, giving her the same answer I'd given Sandra. She set down my portfolio and studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading people across poker tables and blackjack dealers. "You're not just interested in studying the casino business. You're planning to enter it." It wasn't a question. "I'm planning to own it," I said. Dr. Vance became my second mentor, but she also became something more valuable, my first legitimate business connection. She introduced me to other industry professionals, helped me understand the intricate web of relationships that governed gaming operations, and taught me how to speak the language of investors and regulators. But most importantly, she helped me understand that my age wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. In an industry dominated by older men with traditional approaches, a young woman with fresh perspectives and detailed analytical skills could be exactly what investors were looking for. "The gaming industry is evolving," she explained during one of our weekly meetings. Younger demographics are gambling differently than previous generations. They want experiences, not just games. They want technology integration, social interaction, and customized entertainment. Your age gives you insights into these trends that most casino owners simply don't have. That's when I started developing what would become my signature strategy, the behavioral optimization model. Instead of relying on traditional casino marketing approaches, generic promotions, broad demographic targeting, standard loyalty programs, I proposed a system based on individual psychological profiles. Using detailed behavioral analysis, casinos could customize every aspect of a player's experience to maximize engagement and profitability. I knew it would work because I'd been testing it on my parents for months. I started small, conducting experiments, to see how different stimuli affected their gambling behavior. When they mentioned being disappointed about losing at blackjack, I'd casually mention seeing a flyer for a poker tournament. When they complained about crowded tables, I'd suggest they try the newer machines in the quieter section of the casino. Every suggestion I made was carefully calculated to increase their playing time, their bet amounts, or their frequency of visits. And every suggestion worked exactly as I predicted. Within 6 weeks, I could accurately forecast their gambling patterns with about 85% accuracy. I knew which days they'd go to the casino, how long they'd stay, how much they'd lose, and what would trigger them to return the next day. My parents thought I was finally taking an interest in their hobby. They didn't realize I was conducting behavioral experiments that would eventually form the foundation of a revolutionary casino management strategy. But having a brilliant business plan doesn't mean much without capital. And that's where my real education in strategic thinking began. Dr. Vance introduced me to Marcus Webb, a private equity investor who specialized in gaming industry acquisitions. He was in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested he was very good at making money appear from unexpected places. "Patricia tells me you have an interesting proposal," he said when we met at his office in downtown Las Vegas. The walls were covered with framed photographs of him shaking hands with casino owners, politicians, and celebrities I vaguely recognized. Presented my behavioral optimization model with the confidence of someone who'd been testing it in real-world conditions for months. I showed him my demographic analysis of Thunder Creek Casino's customer base, my revenue projections based on optimized player engagement, and my detailed operational improvement strategies. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "Miss Harrington," he said finally, "your analysis is impressive. Your revenue projections are ambitious but achievable. Your understanding of gambling psychology is sophisticated beyond your years." I waited for the but. "But you're 17 years old with no credit history, no business experience, and no collateral. Even if your projections are accurate, even if your strategies are revolutionary, no legitimate lender is going to finance a casino acquisition for a high school student." That's when I played my ace. "Mr. Webb," I said, "what if I told you I could demonstrate my strategy's effectiveness using Thunder Creek Casino's existing customer base without requiring any initial investment?" He leaned forward slightly. "I'd say you have my attention." I explained my proposal, a 6-month pilot program where I would provide consulting services to Thunder Creek Casino, implementing targeted behavioral optimization strategies for their highest value customers. If my methods increased casino revenue by the projected 30%, Mr. Webb would consider financing my acquisition proposal. And if your methods don't work, then you've lost nothing, and I've learned a valuable lesson about the difference between theory and practice. Marcus Webb agreed to the pilot program with one modification. I would work directly with Robert Kellerman, Thunder Creek Casino's current owner, under Webb's supervision. If the program succeeded, Webb would structure a leveraged buyout that would allow me to acquire the casino with minimal personal capital. Meeting Robert Kellerman was like meeting a version of my parents who'd won instead of lost. He was in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades around cigarette smoke and fluorescent lights. He'd built Thunder Creek Casino from a small local operation into a regional destination. But he was tired, ready to retire and skeptical about changing his proven business model. "Marcus tells me you think you can increase my revenue," he said when we met in his office above the casino floor. "I've been running this place for 15 years. I know my customers better than they know themselves." I spent the next hour showing him my analysis of his customer base, including detailed profiles of his top 50 players. I'd identified their playing patterns, their psychological triggers, their optimal engagement strategies, and their maximum lifetime value potential. When I showed him my profile of Marcus and Diana Harrington, my own parents, his expression changed completely. "How did you gather this information?" he asked, studying my analysis of their gambling behavior with fascination. "They're my parents," I said simply. The pilot program began 3 weeks later. I worked at Thunder Creek Casino every day after school and all weekend, implementing customized engagement strategies for their highest value customers. I redesigned their promotional calendar, restructured their loyalty program, and trained their staff to recognize and respond to specific behavioral cues. Most importantly, I convinced Kellerman to install advanced player tracking technology that monitored every aspect of customer behavior in real time. Bet amounts, playing duration, game preferences, response to promotional offers, social interactions, everything was recorded and analyzed to optimize the individual player experience. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within the first month, average playing time increased by 42%. Customer retention improved by 38%. Average bet amounts rose by 26%. Most significantly, total casino revenue increased by 34% compared to the same period the previous year. But the real test of my system was watching it work on my own parents. Using the detailed behavioral profiles I'd developed, I crafted personalized promotional strategies designed specifically for them. My mother received targeted offers for poker tournaments during her most psychologically vulnerable periods. My father got invitations to blackjack games with specific betting limits that aligned with his loss tolerance patterns. I watched my own parents respond to marketing strategies I'd designed, seeing them increase their gambling frequency and duration exactly as my models predicted. They were spending more time at the casino, losing more money per visit, and returning more frequently than ever before. They had no idea their own daughter was orchestrating their destruction with scientific precision. By month 3 of the pilot, program Thunder Creek Casino was having its most profitable quarter in 5 years. Robert Kellerman was getting calls from other casino owners asking about his miracle turnaround. Industry publications were requesting interviews about his innovative customer engagement strategies, and Marcus Webb was finalizing the financing structure for my acquisition proposal. "Alicia," he said during our monthly review meeting, "your system works. It works better than anything I've seen in 20 years of gaming industry investments." The leveraged buyout structure was complex but elegant. Webb's private equity firm would provide $18 million in financing. Robert Kellerman would carry back $4 million in seller financing. I would contribute $3 million in equity, money I didn't have but could access through a combination of business loans secured by projected casino revenues and a strategic partnership with Dr. Vance's university program. The total purchase price, $25 million, exactly what Sandra had estimated 6 months earlier. But there was one final requirement. I needed to turn 18 before the acquisition could be completed. Gaming regulations prohibited anyone under 18 from holding a casino license, regardless of their financing or qualifications. My 18th birthday was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to finalize contracts, complete regulatory approval processes, and prepare for the most expensive birthday present in history. During those 6 weeks, I continued working at Thunder Creek Casino, refining my behavioral optimization systems and preparing for the transition to ownership. I learned about staff management, regulatory compliance, and the intricate daily operations that kept a casino profitable. I also watched my parents' gambling intensify as my targeted marketing strategies pushed them deeper into addiction. They were now visiting the casino 5 days a week, staying later, betting more aggressively, and losing money faster than ever before. The night before my 18th birthday, I stood in the casino that would soon be mine, watching my parents at their usual poker table. They'd lost everything they'd won months earlier, and were now playing with borrowed money, credit card advances, and the few remaining valuable possessions they could pawn. They looked older, more desperate, more hollow than I'd ever seen them. But they also looked exactly like every other gambling addict I'd been studying for the past year. Tomorrow, I would own the machine that was destroying them. Tomorrow, I would become the house that always wins, and they would never see it coming. Acquisition closed on my 18th birthday at 9:47 a.m. in a conference room that smelled like leather and expensive coffee. $25 million changed hands with signatures on documents I'd spent months learning to understand. By 10:15 a.m., I owned Thunder Creek Casino, complete with its 237 slot machines, 42 table games, 3 restaurants, and every single debt owed by every single customer, including my parents' $43,000 gambling debt. But they didn't know any of this yet. As far as Marcus and Diana Harrington were concerned, their daughter was still a high school senior working part-time at a diner, still struggling to pay for insulin, still the same burden they'd been ignoring for years. They had no idea that their biggest creditor was now sleeping in the bedroom down the hall. I decided to let them discover the truth naturally. No dramatic revelations, no confrontational meetings, no angry speeches about betrayal and abandonment. I wanted to watch their world collapse with the same methodical precision they'd used to destroy mine. The first hint came 3 days after the acquisition, when my father tried to use his player's club card at the main cashier window. "I'm sorry." "Mr. Harrington," the cashier said, consulting her computer screen with a confused expression. "Your account shows a credit hold. You'll need to speak with management before you can access any casino credit." My father's face went through several expressions: confusion, irritation, panic, before settling on the particular desperation that gambling addicts get when their supply is threatened. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice getting louder. "I've been a player here for 3 years. My credit's always been good." The cashier glanced around nervously before calling Sandra Chen over. Sandra looked at the screen, looked at my father, and I could see the exact moment she realized what was happening. "Mr. Harrington," she said carefully, "why don't you come with me to discuss this privately?" I watched this exchange from across the casino floor, wearing the business suit that had become my daily uniform and carrying the tablet that contained every detail of the casino's operations. To anyone observing, I looked like exactly what I was, the new owner conducting routine inspections of her property. My father followed Sandra toward the administrative offices, and I knew she was about to explain that the casino had changed ownership, that all existing credit arrangements were under review, and that his account specifically had been flagged for management evaluation. What she wouldn't tell him was that the new owner was his own daughter, and that his credit had been suspended not because of his gambling history, but because I wanted to watch him panic. My mother discovered the change 2 hours later when she tried to join her regular afternoon poker game. "Mrs. Harrington," the poker room manager said, "I need to inform you that all tournament registrations require prior approval from casino management." My mother had been playing in the same Tuesday afternoon tournament for 8 months. It was Alkin's a low-stakes game with a $20 buy-in, but it was also her most consistent losing streak. She'd never won more than $40, but she'd lost an average of $80 every Tuesday for 32 consecutive weeks. "Since when?" she asked, clutching her purse like it contained the last money on earth. "Since the ownership change?" he explained. "All regular players need to have their accounts reviewed and approved by the new management team." That evening, my parents came home more agitated than I'd seen them in months. They sat at our kitchen table, the same table where they'd once counted jackpot winnings while I rationed insulin, and tried to make sense of what was happening at their favorite casino. "Something's changed at Thunder Creek," my father said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. "They're acting like we're some kind of risk." "Maybe we should try Silver Dollar Casino," my mother suggested, "or drive up to Riverside Resort." But I knew they wouldn't leave Thunder Creek permanently. Gambling addicts develop attachments to specific locations, specific games, specific routines. They'd been playing at Thunder Creek for 3 years. They knew the staff, they understood the layout, they had emotional connections to particular slot machines and poker tables. More importantly, they owed money there. And for gambling addicts, debt often feels safer than starting over somewhere new. I let them stew in uncertainty for a week before implementing the next phase of my plan. Using the detailed behavioral profiles I'd developed, I began sending them personalized promotional offers, but with a twist. Instead of encouraging them to gamble more, these offers were designed to create frustration and anxiety. My father received an invitation to a high-roller blackjack tournament with a $5,000 minimum buy-in. The invitation was beautifully printed, made him feel important and valued, but required an entry fee he couldn't possibly afford. My mother got a VIP poker exclusive offering her a seat at a private table with select players only. The offer came with a $300 participation fee and a dress code that required expensive clothing she didn't own. Both offers had expiration dates, creating artificial urgency. Both made them feel simultaneously special and inadequate. Both reminded them that they were no longer welcome in the tier of gambling they aspired to reach. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. My father became obsessed with finding $5,000 for the blackjack tournament. He started researching title loans on his truck, considering pawning his tools, even asking his construction crew if anyone knew about quick cash opportunities. My mother began shopping for VIP-appropriate outfits at thrift stores, trying to assemble a wardrobe that would make her feel worthy of the exclusive poker invitation she couldn't afford to accept. They were spending money they didn't have to chase opportunities that were designed to reject them. But the real explosion came 3 weeks after the acquisition, when they received a certified letter from Thunder Creek Casino's legal department. I was in my room, supposedly doing homework, when I heard my mother scream. It wasn't a surprise scream or an angry scream. It was the sound of someone whose world had just collapsed completely and permanently. I found them in the living room, my mother holding a legal document with shaking hands, while my father stared at the wall like he was seeing through it to some terrible future. "What is it?" I asked, playing the concerned daughter perfectly. My mother looked at me with eyes that had gone completely hollow. "They're calling in our debt," she whispered. "All of it. Thunder Creek wants $43,000 within 30 days, or they're taking us to court." The letter was exactly what I'd instructed the casino's legal team to send. It explained that under new ownership, all outstanding gambling debts were being reviewed and consolidated. Customers with balances exceeding $25,000 were required to establish formal repayment plans or face legal action. "But we've been making payments," my father said, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. "We've been paying them back." "Minimum payments," I said, reading over my mother's shoulder. "Look at this breakdown. You've paid them about $800 total, but the interest and fees brought your balance up to $43,000, which was absolutely true. Their gambling debt had been accumulating compound interest at casino rates for 2 years. Every small payment they'd made had barely covered the monthly fees, let alone reduced the principal balance. "Alicia," my mother said, and I could hear her trying to hold on to hope. "Honey, do you think, could you maybe help us figure this out? You're so good with numbers and paperwork." She was asking her diabetic daughter, whose medical debt had climbed to $60,000 because of their gambling, to help them solve their gambling debt crisis. The irony was so perfect it was almost artistic. "I'll see what I can do," I said. Over the next few days, I watched my parents go through every stage of financial panic. They called debt consolidation companies, researched bankruptcy attorneys, and considered selling our house. They had meetings with loan officers who laughed them out of banks, consultations with financial advisors who told them their situation was hopeless. My father picked up extra construction shifts, working 14-hour days in an attempt to earn money faster than they were losing it to interest and fees. My mother took on additional house cleaning clients, scrubbing other people's bathrooms for minimum wage, while owing more money than she could earn in 2 years. They stopped going to Thunder Creek Casino entirely, not because they'd overcome their addiction, but because they were afraid of making their debt worse. For the first time in 3 years, I came home from school to find both parents in the house, sober, talking to each other about practical matters instead of gambling strategies. It should have felt like a victory. It should have felt like the intervention that finally saved our family. Instead, it felt like watching laboratory rats learning to avoid the maze that had been electrified. The most devastating moment came when my mother found me in my room, supposedly studying for finals, and sat down on my bed with an expression I'd never seen before. "Alicia," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something about your medical bills." I looked up from my textbook, feigning curiosity. "The hospital has been calling about your emergency room visit. The bills they're really high, honey. Higher than we thought." "How high?" $67,000. She said the number, like it physically hurt to speak. "With all the follow-up appointments and medications, it's $67,000. The medical debt had continued growing while I'd been focused on the casino acquisition. Interest, late fees, collection charges. My near-death experience was now worth more than a luxury car. "But here's the thing," my mother continued. "Your father and I have been talking, and we think maybe we can work something out with the casino. Maybe we can negotiate a payment plan, get them to reduce the balance, something. And if we can fix our debt, maybe we can help with yours too." She was sitting on my bed, promising to solve my medical debt crisis by negotiating with a casino owned by her own daughter. "That sounds like a good plan," I said. 3 days later, my parents requested a meeting with Thunder Creek Casino's management to discuss their debt situation. The request came through the casino's customer service department, was forwarded to Sandra Chen, and landed on my desk with a note. "They want to meet with the owner." I scheduled the meeting for a Thursday afternoon in the same conference room where I'd signed the acquisition documents 5 weeks earlier. I arrived wearing my standard business attire, a navy blue suit that made me look older than 18, carrying a leather portfolio that contained their complete gambling history, and accompanied by the casino's attorney for legal support. My parents arrived wearing their best clothes, holding a folder of financial documents they'd prepared to prove their willingness to cooperate, and carrying the desperate hope of people who'd finally decided to face their problems head-on. They walked into that conference room expecting to meet with a casino executive who might show them mercy. Instead, they found their diabetic daughter, sitting at the head of a mahogany table with legal documents spread in front of her and a pen in her hand. The silence lasted exactly 37 seconds. I counted. My mother spoke first. "Alicia?" she said, like she was seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here?" "I own this place," I said simply. "As of 5 weeks ago, I am the sole proprietor of Thunder Creek Casino, which means you owe me $43,000. My father's face went through every emotion humans are capable of experiencing in about 15 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, realization, horror, and finally, a kind of broken understanding. "You bought the casino," he said, not as a question, but as someone trying to make sense of an impossible reality. "I bought the casino that was destroying our family," I corrected. "I bought the place where you chose to spend my insulin money. I bought the business that you love more than your own daughter's life." That's when my mother started crying. Not the desperate tears of someone facing financial ruin, but the deep, choking sobs of someone who'd just realized the true cost of their choices. "Alicia," she whispered, "we can explain." "You don't need to explain," I said. "I understand perfectly. You're gambling addicts who sacrifice their daughter's health to fund your addiction. The only difference is that now I'm the house, and the house always wins." After the conference room revelation, my parents didn't speak to me for 6 days. Not angry silence. Something deeper. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been living in a completely different reality than they thought. They moved through our house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers, when they thought I couldn't hear. My mother stopped cooking dinner. My father stopped watching his evening poker shows. They existed in a state of suspended disbelief, trying to process the fact that their 18-year-old daughter had orchestrated the systematic destruction of their gambling empire. On day 7, my father knocked on my bedroom door. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing in my doorway like he was afraid to enter without permission. I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing quarterly revenue projections for the casino. The numbers were excellent. My behavioral optimization strategies had increased profits by 42% in just 2 months. I was on track to pay off the acquisition loan 3 years ahead of schedule. "About what?" I asked. "About this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything: the casino, the debt, the betrayal, the complete reversal of our family dynamic. "About what happens now." I saved my work and closed the laptop. "What would you like to happen now?" It was a genuine question. For 3 years, I'd been reacting to their choices, adapting to their addiction, surviving their neglect. Now I had the power to determine our family's future, and I honestly didn't know what I wanted that future to look like. "I want to understand," he said, sitting down on the edge of my bed like he had when I was younger and having nightmares. "Help me understand how you did this." So I told him everything. The secret savings account my grandmother had helped me establish. The research I'd conducted during my countless hours waiting in casino parking lots. The business plan I'd developed by studying their gambling patterns. The mentors I'd found, the connections I'd made, the leveraged buyout structure that had allowed me to acquire a $25 million business with minimal personal capital. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "You've been planning this for over a year," he said finally. "I've been surviving for over a year," I corrected. "Planning suggests I had options. I didn't have options. I had insulin needs and parents who chose slot machines over my life." "Alicia," he said, and his voice broke slightly. "We never meant for it to get this bad." "Dad," I said gently, "you pawned my glucose monitor to fund a casino trip. You let our health insurance lapse while spending $300 a week on poker games. You came home from the casino celebrating jackpots while I was rationing life-saving medication." He nodded slowly, like each word was a physical blow he'd been expecting. "I know," he whispered. "I know we did those things. But I don't understand how we became people who could do those things." That's when I realized something that changed everything. My parents weren't evil people who'd chosen to hurt me. They were sick people who'd lost the ability to choose anything except their addiction. Understanding. That didn't forgive what they'd done, but it gave me a framework for deciding what to do next. "Dad," I said, "what would you say if I told you there was a way to fix this?" Over the next week, I developed what I called the Recovery Integration Program. It was part debt restructuring, part addiction intervention, part family therapy, and part business partnership. The program had 3 phases. Phase 1, immediate stabilization. My parents would enter a 90-day gambling addiction treatment program at Sunrise Recovery Center, a residential facility in Arizona that specialized in behavioral addictions. The cost, $30,000 per person, would be paid by the casino as part of their debt restructuring plan. During their treatment, I would manage their finances completely. All income would go into accounts I controlled. All expenses would be approved by me. They would have no access to credit cards, cash, or any form of independent financial decision-making. Phase 2. Structured reintegration. After completing residential treatment, they would return home under a strict financial monitoring system. They would work regular jobs, my father in construction, my mother in house cleaning, and contribute 60% of their income toward their gambling debt repayment. They would attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times per week, participate in family therapy sessions twice per month, and submit to random drug and alcohol testing to ensure they weren't replacing gambling addiction with substance abuse. Most importantly, they would work part-time at Thunder Creek Casino, under my direct supervision. Phase 3. Earned independence. After demonstrating 2 years of consistent recovery, they would gradually regain control of their finances. Their debt would be considered satisfied regardless of the remaining balance, and they would transition from employees to minority partners in an expanded casino operation. This wasn't forgiveness. It was a business proposition with built-in accountability measures. My mother's reaction to the program was immediate acceptance. "Yes," she said before I'd even finished explaining Phase 3. "Whatever you want, however long it takes." Yes, my father took longer to decide. He asked detailed questions about the treatment facility, the financial monitoring, and the work requirements. He wanted to understand exactly what he was agreeing to before committing. "Alicia," he said finally, "this program you've designed, it's not just about us getting clean. You're offering us a chance to be part of your business." "I'm offering you a chance to earn back your place in this family," I said, "but it has to be on terms that protect me from your addiction. And if we fail? If we relapse or can't handle the restrictions? Then you lose everything. The house, the relationship, the business partnership opportunity. You will lose me permanently." He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him weighing the familiar comfort of his addiction against the uncertain difficulty of recovery. "When do we start?" he asked. While my parents were in Arizona undergoing treatment, I focused on transforming Thunder Creek Casino from a local gambling operation into a regional entertainment destination, using the revenue generated by my behavioral optimization strategies. I invested in facility upgrades, technology improvements, and expansion projects. I added a spa, a conference center, and a fine dining restaurant managed by a chef I'd recruited from Las Vegas. But more importantly, I began developing responsible gambling programs that would become the foundation of my business philosophy. Implemented mandatory spending limits for all players, required cooling-off periods for anyone showing signs of problem gambling, and created support systems for customers dealing with addiction. I partnered with treatment centers, hired certified addiction counselors, and established a fund to help gambling addicts access recovery services. The gaming industry thought I was crazy. Casinos make money by encouraging excessive gambling, not by limiting it. But I'd learned something from studying my parents' addiction. Sustainable customers are more profitable than addicted customers. Addicted customers eventually lose everything and stop coming. They develop debt they can't pay, destroy their relationships, and often end up bankrupt or dead. They're not a renewable resource. But customers who gamble responsibly, who set limits and stick to them, who treat casino visits as entertainment, rather than investment strategies, those customers can gamble for decades. They bring friends, they attend events, they become part of a community. Within 6 months, Thunder Creek Casino had the highest customer retention rate in the state. Our profit margins were higher than casinos twice our size. We were attracting new demographics, younger professionals, tourist groups, business conferences, who saw us as a sophisticated entertainment venue rather than a desperate gambling hall. More importantly, We were becoming a model for responsible gaming that other casinos began studying and imitating. Industry publications started writing articles about the Thunder Creek model. Gaming conferences invited me to speak about sustainable casino management. Regulatory agencies praised our approach to addiction prevention and customer protection. At 19, I was featured on the cover of Casino Management Monthly with the headline, "The Teen Mogul Who's Revolutionizing Gaming." But the real transformation was happening in Arizona, where my parents were learning to live without the constant stimulation of gambling. I visited them once during their treatment, driving 8 hours through desert highways to spend a weekend at Sunrise Recovery Center. The facility looked like a luxury resort. Palm trees, swimming pools, modern buildings designed to feel more like a spa retreat than a medical facility. I found my parents in a group therapy session, sitting in a circle with 8 other gambling addicts, talking about triggers and coping strategies with the kind of analytical intensity they'd once applied to poker odds and slot machine patterns. My mother looked healthier than I'd seen her in years. She'd gained weight, her skin had cleared up, and her eyes had a focused clarity that I'd forgotten existed. My father seemed calmer, more present, like he was inhabiting his own body instead of just borrowing it between casino visits. During our family therapy session, they apologized. Not the desperate, manipulative apologies I'd heard 100 times before, but genuine acknowledgments of the harm they'd caused. "Alicia," my mother said, "I need you to know that we understand what we did to you. Not just the money or the neglect, but the betrayal. We made you take care of yourself when you were just a child, and then we punished you for being stronger than us. We turned you into our parents," my father added, "and then we resented you for it." Their apologies were important, but what mattered more was their understanding. They'd learned to see their addiction not as a series of bad choices, but as a chronic illness that required ongoing management. They'd developed tools for recognizing triggers, strategies for avoiding risky situations, and support systems for maintaining recovery. Most importantly, they'd learned to separate their gambling addiction from their love for me. "We never stopped loving you," my mother said during our private conversation, "but we stopped being able to show it in ways that mattered." "I know," I said, and for the first time in years, I meant it. When they completed treatment and returned home, everything was different. They followed the recovery integration program exactly as designed, working regular jobs, attending meetings, participating in therapy, contributing to debt repayment. But they were also different people. They asked about my day, helped with household responsibilities, and showed genuine interest in my business without trying to exploit it for gambling opportunities. My father became one of Thunder Creek Casino's most effective security guards, not because he was intimidating, but because he could recognize problem gambling from across a room. He developed intervention techniques for helping customers recognize when they'd crossed the line from entertainment to addiction. My mother became my assistant manager, handling customer relations and staff coordination with the organizational skills she'd once applied to tracking casino promotions. She created programs for employee wellness, customer education, and community outreach. Working together at the casino should have been weird, maybe even triggering for their recovery. Instead, it became therapeutic. They were contributing to a business that promoted responsible gambling rather than enabling destructive addiction. 6 months after their return, we held our first annual Responsible Gaming Awareness Day at Thunder Creek Casino. Instead of promoting jackpots and big wins, we hosted seminars about gambling addiction, offered free financial counseling, and provided resources for anyone struggling with problem gambling. My parents spoke at the event, sharing their story of addiction and recovery with casino customers who might be walking the same dangerous path. 3 years ago, my father told an audience of 200 people, "I was willing to let my diabetic daughter go without insulin so I could play poker." Today, I work for a casino owned by that same daughter, and our mission is to make sure no family goes through what ours did. The applause was genuine and sustained. Several people approached my parents afterward, asking for help with their own gambling problems or seeking resources for family members struggling with addiction. That night, driving home from the event, my mother turned to me from the passenger seat. "Alicia," she said, "I'm proud of who you've become. Not just the business success, but the person you've become despite what we put you through." "I'm proud of who you're becoming too," I said, and I realized I meant that completely. The girl who'd nearly died in a casino parking lot had become a woman who owned casinos. The parents who'd chosen gambling over their daughter's life had become advocates for responsible gaming and addiction recovery. We'd all been transformed by the journey, but in ways none of us could have predicted when it began. 2 years after, my parents completed their recovery program. I stood in the same parking lot where I'd once collapsed from diabetic ketoacidosis. But everything had changed. The cracked asphalt had been replaced with decorative stone. The flickering neon signs had been upgraded to elegant LED displays. Where desperate gamblers once chain-smoked in their cars, families now walked toward a destination that offered entertainment without exploitation. But the biggest change wasn't the renovation, it was me. I was 20 years old, CEO of a casino empire that now included 3 properties across 2 states. Thunder Creek Casino had become the flagship of Harrington Gaming Enterprises, a company built on the revolutionary principle that casinos could be profitable without destroying lives. My parents had earned their way back into the business as full partners, not through blood relation, but through 2 years of proven recovery and invaluable contributions to our responsible gaming initiatives. My father now directed security, operations across all our properties, while my mother managed our addiction recovery outreach programs. And me? I'd become something I never expected, a leader in an industry I'd once despised. The morning of our 2nd annual Responsible Gaming Summit, I received a phone call that would complete a circle I'd been drawing for 3 years. "Miss Harrington," the voice said, "this is Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital. I understand you've been working with families affected by gambling addiction?" Dr. Williams explained that they'd been seeing an increase in children brought to the emergency room with medical complications related to their parents' gambling problems. Kids like me, diabetics without insulin, asthmatics without inhalers, children with chronic conditions whose parents had prioritized casino visits over medical care. "We'd like to partner with your organization," she said, "to create an intervention program for families where gambling addiction is affecting children's health." That afternoon, I found myself back in a hospital conference room, but this time I was the one with solutions instead of problems. Dr. Williams introduced me to her team, pediatric specialists, social workers, family therapists, and I presented the framework we'd developed at Thunder Creek for identifying and helping gambling-affected families. "The key," I explained, showing them our intervention protocols, "is understanding that gambling addiction doesn't just affect the gambler. It creates ripple effects that can literally be life-threatening for dependent family members." Dr. Martinez, my old endocrinologist, was in the meeting. She recognized me immediately. "Alicia," she said during a break, "I've been following your story in the industry publications. I have to ask, how does it feel to own the casino that almost killed you?" It was a question I'd been asked by journalists, competitors, and recovery advocates. But hearing it from the doctor who'd saved my life gave it a different weight. "It feels like justice," I said. "Not revenge justice, but restorative justice. I took something that was designed to destroy families and turned it into something that helps them." We spent the next 6 months developing the Guardian Angel program, a collaboration between hospitals, casinos, and social services to identify and intervene when gambling addiction was endangering children's health. The program worked by training emergency room staff to recognize signs of gambling-related neglect, establishing protocols for connecting affected families with treatment resources, and creating a fund to cover medical expenses for children whose health had been compromised by their parents' addiction. Most importantly, we developed a database that allowed hospitals to flag parents whose children repeatedly presented with complications from undertreated chronic conditions. If the pattern suggested gambling-related neglect, social workers would conduct family assessments and connect them with our recovery support services. The program launched simultaneously at 12 hospitals across 3 states. Within the first year, we'd identified and helped over 200 families where gambling addiction was affecting children's medical care. But the program's most significant success story was much closer to home. On a Thursday evening in September, 18 months after the Guardian Angel program launched, I received an emergency call from Dr. Martinez. "Alicia," she said, "we have a situation. A 16-year-old diabetic girl was brought in by ambulance. Severe ketoacidosis. Same presentation you had 3 years ago. Her parents are at Silver Dollar Casino right now, and they're refusing to leave to come to the hospital." Silver Dollar Casino was our biggest competitor, a traditional operation that still used the predatory practices we'd abandoned. They offered unlimited credit, encouraged problem gambling, and had actively opposed our responsible gaming initiatives. "What's the girl's name?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "Emma Rodriguez. Her parents are Maria and Carlos Rodriguez." I drove to Silver Dollar Casino with my father, who'd become expert at gambling addiction interventions. We found the Rodriguez family at a blackjack table, playing with the desperate intensity I remembered from my own parents' worst days. The casino management tried to prevent us from approaching their customers, but I had legal authority as director of a hospital-partnered intervention program. More importantly, I had moral authority as someone who'd lived through exactly what Emma Rodriguez was experiencing. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, approaching their table. "My name is Alicia Harrington. Your daughter Emma is in the hospital right now, and she needs you." Carlos Rodriguez looked up from his cards with the glazed expression of someone deep in gambling trance. "We'll go after this hand," he said, not really focusing on me. "Sir," I said more firmly, "your daughter has diabetic ketoacidosis. She could die if she doesn't receive immediate medical attention and family support." Maria Rodriguez turned around then, and I saw my own mother's face from 3 years earlier, hollow, desperate, torn between addiction and love. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm someone who almost died in a casino parking lot because my parents were too busy gambling to remember I needed insulin," I said. "I'm someone who understands exactly what your daughter is going through right now." The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and changed 3 lives forever. I told the Rodriguez family my story, explained the Guardian Angel program, and offered them immediate access to treatment and support services. But more importantly, I helped them understand something that had taken my own parents months in residential treatment to grasp. Their gambling addiction wasn't just hurting them, it was killing their daughter. Carlos Rodriguez broke down completely when I explained that Emma had been rationing her insulin for 2 weeks, trying to make her prescription last until they remembered to refill it. Maria Rodriguez cried when she realized they'd spent Emma's medical fund on their current losing streak. My father, speaking from his own experience as a recovering gambling addict, helped them understand that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing, and that recovery was possible with the right support. 3 years ago, he told them, I was exactly where you are now. I'd pawned my daughter's medical equipment to fund my gambling. I thought I was just unlucky, just going through a bad streak. I didn't understand that I was committing slow-motion murder. We drove the Rodriguez family to the hospital where Emma was stable but still critical. The reunion between parents and daughter was heartbreaking and beautiful. Guilt, relief, love, and terror all mixed together in a way that was painfully familiar. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside as the family was reunited. Alicia, she said, watching you tonight, seeing what you've built, understanding what you've accomplished, I need you to know something. You didn't just survive your parents' addiction. You transformed it into something that saves other families. Set. Months later, Emma Rodriguez spoke at our third annual Responsible Gaming Summit. Her parents had completed treatment. Her medical care was fully funded through our Guardian Angel program, and she was thriving academically and physically. Alicia Harrington saved my life, she told an audience of casino executives, healthcare, professionals, and recovery advocates. Not just by getting my parents into treatment, but by creating a world where what happened to her doesn't have to happen to other kids. After Emma's speech, I stepped outside onto Thunder Creek Casino's observation deck. The deck overlooked the gaming floor where my parents had once lost everything, but also the conference center where we now hosted recovery meetings, the restaurant where families celebrated without financial anxiety, and the counseling offices where people learned to choose healing over addiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Vance, my old mentor from the university. Saw the news about your expansion into California. Congratulations on becoming the youngest casino mogul in American history. But the text that mattered more came from my mother. Proud of you, not for what you own, but for who you've become. Standing on that deck, I thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd collapsed in this parking lot, desperate and abandoned, watching her parents choose machines over her life. That girl had been powerless, dependent, slowly dying from medical neglect. The woman I'd become owned the machines that had once owned my family. I employed over 400 people, generated millions in tax revenue for local communities, and had fundamentally changed how an entire industry thought about customer responsibility. But more than that, I'd learned something that no business, school could teach. Sometimes the thing that breaks you contains the blueprint for what you're meant to build. My parents' gambling addiction had nearly killed me, but it had also given me intimate knowledge of addiction psychology that I'd transformed into revolutionary business practices. Their betrayal had forced me to become self-reliant, analytical, and strategically minded in ways that made me an exceptional entrepreneur. Their worst failure had become my greatest strength. A year later, I testified before Congress about gambling addiction and its impact on families. I spoke to senators and representatives who were considering federal regulations for the gaming industry, sharing data from our responsible gaming programs, and advocating for policies that would protect vulnerable populations. Honorable senators, I said, reading from prepared remarks that summarized 5 years of work. Gambling addiction is not a personal failure. It's a public health crisis that destroys families, bankrupts communities, and kills children through medical neglect. But it's also a crisis that can be addressed through responsible business practices and adequate support systems. I presented our model for sustainable casino operations, our intervention protocols for problem gambling, and our data showing that responsible gaming practices actually increased long-term profitability. But I also told them Emma Rodriguez's story, and my own story, and the stories of dozens of other families who'd been saved by programs that treated gambling addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral weakness. After my testimony, Senator Patricia Chen, Sandra's sister as it turned out, approached me in the hallway. "Miss Harrington," she said, "your testimony was compelling, but I have to ask, do you ever regret buying that casino? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd chosen a different path?" It was the same question Dr. Martinez had asked, but with a different emphasis. Not about justice, but about choices. "Senator," I said, 3 years ago, I was a sick teenager whose parents were slowly killing her through neglect. Today, I'm a healthy young woman who employs hundreds of people, provides medical care for children like Emma Rodriguez, and has proven that businesses can be profitable without being predatory. I paused, thinking about all the roads not taken, all the different ways my story could have unfolded. I didn't choose this path, I said finally. This path chose me, but I'm grateful it did, because it let me turn the worst thing that ever happened to me into the best thing I ever did for other people. That evening, I drove home to the house where I'd once hidden insulin in my bedroom and rationed medication to survive my parents' addiction. But now it was a house where my parents asked about my day, where we had family dinners without gambling debt hanging over us, and where my medical supplies sat openly on the kitchen counter because everyone in the family understood their importance. My father was in the garage, working on a motorcycle he was restoring, not because he needed money for gambling, but because he enjoyed creating something with his hands. My mother was in the kitchen, cooking dinner and listening to a podcast about addiction recovery advocacy. "How was Washington?" she asked when I walked in. "Productive," I said. "I think we're going to see some real policy changes that will help families like ours." "Like ours used to be," she corrected gently. "Like ours used to be," I agreed. That night, I sat in my room, the same room where I'd once planned my survival while my parents gambled away my future, and wrote in the journal I'd been keeping since the casino acquisition. Entry 8047. Today, I testified before Congress about the industry that almost killed me and that I now lead. 5 years ago, I was a diabetic teenager whose parents chose slot machines over insulin. Today, I'm a casino owner whose business model is built on protecting families from the addiction that destroyed mine. I used to think recovery meant getting back what you'd lost. Now I understand that recovery means building something better from the pieces of what was broken. My parents didn't just choose gambling over my health. They chose addiction over everything. Their marriage, their home, their relationship with their daughter, their own self-respect. But in destroying everything, they also created the conditions for me to rebuild everything better. I am not the same person who collapsed in that parking lot. I am not the daughter who begged for insulin, money while her parents celebrated jackpots. I am not the teenager who hid glucose monitors to keep them from being pawned. I am Alicia Harrington, CEO of Harrington Gaming Enterprises, advocate for responsible gaming, and proof that the house doesn't always have to win by making everyone else lose. Sometimes the house wins by making sure everyone wins. I closed the journal and looked out my window at Thunder Creek Casino in the distance, its lights reflecting off the lake like fallen stars. Tomorrow, those lights would welcome families seeking entertainment, individuals working through addiction, and communities benefiting from businesses that prioritized people over profits. The girl who'd nearly died to feed her parents' addiction had become the woman who owned their addiction. But more than that, she'd become someone who could transform the thing that had nearly destroyed her into something that saved others. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with forgiveness. Mine ended with revolution. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.